Welcome back to this special edition on I-24 News. The killing of Qassem Soleimani and the pro-Iranian Iraqi militia leader Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis at Baghdad airport climaxed a week of growing tensions between the U.S. and Iran that were played out on Iraqi soil. Our international affairs correspondent Bianca Zanini has more on that in this report.
Iran's top general, Qassem Soleimani, one of the most powerful men in the country, has been killed by the U.S. in Iraq. A dramatic move after a week of rapidly escalating tensions in the region. This latest round began with a rocket attack on a base near Kirkuk, Iraq, where a U.S. contractor was killed and 4 Americans injured. The U.S. accused the Kataib Hezbollah, the Hezbollah Brigade, which is an Iranian-backed militia, of carrying out the attack. U.S. President Donald Trump blamed Iran directly and responded promptly. Over the weekend, the U.S. launched airstrikes against the Hezbollah Brigade in Iraq and Syria, killing dozens of their members.
What we did was take a decisive response that makes clear what President Trump has said for months and months and months, which is that we will not stand for the Islamic Republic of Iran to take actions that put American men and women in jeopardy.
On Tuesday, protesters stormed the American embassy compound in Baghdad. Demonstrators breached the outer wall of the compound, causing damage, but didn't enter any of the main buildings. The protests ended largely without incident. President Trump blamed Iran for the embassy protests, saying it would be held responsible. Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, shrugged off the warning and said Trump was powerless to do anything to Iran. Then, in the early hours of Friday, an American airstrike killed Iran's most powerful general. For the past month, the streets in Iraq have been flooded with protests. Demonstrators angry at their government, at the U.S., and at the extent of Iranian influence in their country. The timing of the airstrikes played into that. And now, voices in Iran are calling for revenge. The U.S. and its allies are bracing themselves for further turmoil in the Middle East. Bianca Zanini, I-24 News.
Well, as we saw, there was certainly provocation for the killing of Soleimani, but was it the right move at the right time for the U.S.? Well, joining us from Washington is Matthew R.J. Brodsky, Senior Fellow at the Gold Institute for International Strategy, and Brian Katulis, Senior Fellow at the Center for American Progress, also in Washington. And Brian, I'm just looking some of your comments today on social media. You call it the Soleimani strike a risky move. For every action, there's a reaction. And the lack of a clear U.S. strategy for the Middle East has hindered America's ability to confront Iran's support for terrorism. So I sense some ambivalence there, certainly, at least about the timing here.
Well, it's less about the timing and more about whether there's an actual strategy or approach. I've spent the last couple of hours talking to some officials in the Middle East, in many of the governments across the region. And beneath the surface, there's real concern about President Trump and whether he's a man with a real plan. I think the consensus is it's good that Qassem Soleimani is no longer out there threatening people, but the real worry, and the worry I think overrides the relief that Soleimani's gone, is that the United States really doesn't know what it's going to do next and whether it will actually stand by and back its partners in the region who are threatened. Many people cited to me today what Trump did on Syria and basically turned his back on Kurdish allies. And I think that's a dominant fear right now, is what's next and whether the United States actually has a clear policy and strategy, or we're just conducting one-off strikes like this without a clear strategy.
Well, Matthew, maybe you want to respond to that, because looking at your comments, I see no ambivalence. You compare this to the killing of that President Obama, of course, did of Osama bin Laden, say perhaps even more significant. You seem to be 100% on board with this action.
Oh, absolutely. Bin Laden was, of course, responsible for a large amount of deaths, some 3,000 American deaths. And by the time we caught him, our intelligence services were surprised, apparently, to the extent to which he still was able to exercise control over aspects of various operations. But he was holed up in a compound inside of Pakistan. With Soleimani, what you have is an active terrorist who has been traveling around the Middle East, The United States had intelligence that he was planning an attack imminently. It showed further evidence that given the previous day's events, that the message when the U.S. had a very pinpoint attack response, finally attacking 5 different bases, that the leaders in Tehran weren't getting the message. So the United States, of course, did the right thing under the Trump administration, which was to kill this terrorist leader who is an active, ongoing threat around the Middle East, who has got a lot of American blood in his hands, killed some 600 U.S. soldiers he's responsible for, thousands wounded over last decade. And, of course, he's without his help, there wouldn't be a slaughter of some 500,000 Syrians. Okay. And the list goes on and on.
Matthew, what about the point?
He was a bad guy.
Right, but what about the point Brian made that perhaps the Trump administration has not prepared the ground in the region to deal with the possible consequences?
Yeah, look, I mean, to Brian's point, if you spend your time speaking only to those members of the echo chamber, you're going to hear the same thing. Frankly, the fact that he was taken out was fine. When you have that target of opportunity,
what does that mean?
You take it. You take the opportunity
I don't even know what that means.
In order to kill a terrorist. I'll explain what that means. It means you're echoing the same points as Ben Rhodes, echoing the same points as Senator Chris Murphy. These
I'm not.
Who frankly are not to be taken seriously.
No, I'm not.
That's what
what
your comment just was then.
Are you
Matthew,
kidding me?
let Brian respond. Yes, let Brian respond.
No, I'm not. I mean, listen to you.
Telling you what.
Talking about an echo chamber.
Matthew, let Brian respond.
Listen to you. You are echo chambering the Trump administration's talking points, and my main point was an analytical one, not a talking points one, an echo chamber one. And it shows, like your comments right here. I hope people in Israel
told everyone in advance.
No, your comments and your comments and interruptions demonstrate how
operation.
Bad.
Gentlemen,
your comments and your interruptions demonstrate how you have degraded the debate here in the United States on national security. And I'm not against the strike. That was not my point. You're not even listening. You're not listening, and you have lowered the quality of the debate by simply saying that I'm offering an echo chamber of points from Ben Rhodes. That's ridiculous.
Okay, let's stay on the substance. I want to go to a tweet from John Bolton, the former national security advisor, who tweeted today, "Congratulations."
And Matt will echo chamber him.
Okay, but let's listen to his. Listen.
Matt will just echo chamber him.
But let's just hear look at that tweet.
Stupid.
Saying this was a
tremendously stupid.
Right. This was a decisive blow against Iran's malign Quds Force activities worldwide. Hope this is the first step to regime change in Tehran. Well, let me just ask you, Matthew, in your view, is this the first step to a regime change in Tehran? Is that now where the Trump administration could be heading? And would you support that?
Well, contrary to what we heard, a minute ago, there's actually a strategy that was laid out in a speech by Secretary of State Pompeo in May 2018. Now, the U.S. official policy at this point is not for regime change. One can argue whether the points that Pompeo has laid out that Iran would need to address in order to come in compliance with what the administration is looking for. One could argue whether, well, that would mean that the entire raison d'etre for the existence of the revolutionary regime would in fact have to change anyways. But the fact is, it's not for regime change right now. It's to force a point where the leaders need to come to the table and negotiate not only on their nuclear program, but their malign activities throughout the region and several other issues that seriously were not addressed.
Okay, so I want Brian to respond to that on substance, because, Brian, I think you addressed that in one of your tweets. You wrote that maximum pressure on Iran begat maximum resistance from Iran.
Yeah. And again, I think that this plan or approach doesn't actually have a clear endpoint from the Trump administration. When I talk to people in the administration, I hear multiple voices when I hear the idea of what's next. This notion that we're actually going to sit down and talk with Iran. I think some in the administration, including President Trump, want to do that. They tried to do it. He seemed desperate to do it in September at the UN General Assembly. Other members of administration seem to say what John Bolton says, is that we want regime change. And that's the real problem here, and the point I was trying to make, not echo chambering someone else, is that this administration and President Trump is a man without a plan. They don't know actually what's coming next. And in my discussions with leaders in Israel and in many of the Arab governments today, they privately say, look, we don't actually see a clear plan from President Trump about what's next. They're uncertain about what he'll actually do, whether he'll actually do what he did with North Korea and sit down with a dictator and not get anything for it, or whether he'll actually escalate and send more troops to the Middle East. I mean, it's kind of a mess, and none of our partners or allies truly trust or rely on what President Trump is doing.
Right. Well, let me go back, Matthew, because we do see President Trump now sending more troops in the region where he was earlier pulling them out. How do you think the Trump administration would or should respond if there is an Iranian attack, perhaps directly on American forces, be it in Iraq or elsewhere in the region?
Well, first, I think we should appreciate the difference between President Trump's policy and that of President Obama, his predecessor. The thinking previously was to bribe the Iranian regime with well over $100 billion and to enter into a nuclear deal that would, not actually prevent them from getting nuclear weapons. It was based on a fantasy. In essence, we ended up bribing and helping pay for an ethnic cleansing campaign throughout the region that Iran and Qassem Soleimani was in charge of. That is no longer the policy. That, of course, seems like a much smarter idea. As far as what the U.S. should expect in retaliation, I think the best template to look at, frankly, is the war that Israel has been engaged in, not of its choice, with Iran in Syria. The fact is there's managed escalations there. There are smart decisions here and there and probing, but there isn't a rush to war by Iran because the leaders get to make a decision on that point. And they know that if they went to war with Israel, forget the United States for a second, that's a war they would lose without nuclear weapons. They certainly would have a much worse time trying to go after the United States in that way, all of which brings it back to the fact that Iran must not get a nuclear weapon, which is what everything in the end is all about and what President Obama essentially legalized and fast-tracked.
All right. Brian, it seems like a sort of recipe, and Matthew's making the argument for, say, managed conflict. How do you respond to that?
Good luck with that. And again, I think I'd rather debate issues here in 2020 than in 2015. And I think rather than recycling talking points from the right wing, like Matthew has done, we need to talk about what's coming next.
You can try responding to any one of them.
And the main point is that the United States is not prepared. We don't actually have a clear plan to deal with this escalation, much in the same way that I think the President Trump sold out our allies in Syria in the fight against ISIS, and much in the same way that he stood by while that slaughter went on inside of Syria, and similarly has done very little inside of Yemen. We're going to see, I think, more chaos in the region and not this notion that somehow one of these strikes is actually going to lead to stability and strengthening America's position in the region.
All right, gentlemen, I'm sure the debate over this and the broader question of the Trump administration strategy and U.S. strategy toward Iran will continue. I'd like to thank you for joining us, Brian Katulis from the Center for American Progress, and Matthew Brodsky joining us also from Washington. Gentlemen, thank you. That's our